Recently, on a walk through Poblano, I spotted some graffiti on a metal door. Someone had taken a marker and scrawled in all caps, "Expats, go homo. Inmigrantes, yes." Let's be generous here and assume that the intended message was something along the lines of "Expats, go home. Immigrants, welcome." In that case, it's not the first graffiti I've seen about such things. Is there an anti-expat feeling in Spain? Is being anti-American still a thing? Or are a couple of poorly spelled graffiti messages not an actual social trend? Hey everybody, it's Daniel. Welcome back to Spain to Go, the best podcast in the entire multiverse for all things Spain. This is episode 111. 111. And today we're going to talk about anti-expat and anti-American sentiment in Spain. I've got kind of a lot to say about this because the issue of expats versus immigrants is always a bit entertaining if you're in the mood for some semantic debate that has no consequences in real life. Also, we have a little bit about Spanish-American history, the history of the relations between Spain and the US, and more. If you would like to support this podcast, please go to expatmadrid.com/donate. You can donate anything from €3 to however much you want on there. expatmadrid.com/donate. Trying to make this podcast a once-a-week thing, and you can help with your contribution. Thank you very much. expatmadrid.com/donate. First off, what is an expat anyway? I use expatmadrid.com as my domain name because I figure if people are using Google, that is a better search term. However, the word expat is now a part of the Spanish vocabulary. It's only been a part of the Spanish vocabulary for a short time, as far as I can tell. Several months ago, I read an article in La Vanguardia explaining the whole expat versus immigrant thing. Expats, they said, were from countries with a higher GDP per capita than Spain has, and they were mostly moving abroad for the adventure or the lifestyle. On the other hand, immigrants were from poorer countries, those with a GDP per capita lower than Spain's, and were here out of economic necessity. I think that definition of expat versus immigrant is incomplete for a couple of reasons. First, because GDP per capita is an average that tells you about the economy in a country, but it has very little to do with the financial situation of any given person. Bill Gates walks into a bar and the average net worth of that bar's customers immediately increases by $1 billion each. Why? Because that's how averages work. My second problem with that definition of expats versus immigrants is that it doesn't give a very clear understanding of how the world works. In fact, when I read that definition, I wondered if the person who wrote it had ever spoken to a foreigner. Have you? Go talk to someone from a country poorer than your own. They may well be having an adventure rather than fleeing from poverty. They may be advancing their education, or they may have found love in another country. They may have no plan whatsoever, but they came because their cousin moved here first and said it was fun, and so now they're here too. I have talked to quite a lot of people in my 20-plus years abroad, and the reasons for moving are quite varied. The real world is much more complex than the idea that people from rich countries are rich and people from poor countries are poor. So if that is your definition of expat versus immigrant, I think you are wrong. But still, I expect that the people who do graffiti that says expats go homo, or expats go home perhaps, probably have something like that in mind when they use the word expats. They're probably thinking of high-end immigrants who are here in Spain for the lifestyle rather than the economy. By that I mean digital nomads or remote workers or pensioners who are here with a relatively large amount of money who might be seen to be driving up prices for the locals. So, is there an anti-expat sentiment in Spain? Having said that, I can't say that apart from a bit of graffiti, I've noticed any anti-expat sentiment. People in Spain are pretty chill about who you are and why you're here, at least most of the time. A corollary to this would be, don't be a dick who goes around antagonizing people, and don't start questioning them about their personal politics. You'll avoid a whole lot of annoying discussions that way. In my life, I talk to people at the gym who usually want to talk about gym bro stuff. Between themselves, they talk about football or getting hair transplants in Turkey, or occasionally about the incompetence and corruption of their own politicians. Not a lot of wide-ranging geopolitical talk in the locker room, in other words. Besides gym bros, I talk to plenty of other people, mostly expats or immigrants of one kind or another. And those conversations are usually about topics that directly affect our lives. The housing crisis, the never-ending struggle with bureaucracy, maybe dating Spanish girls. There are many topics of conversation, then, that have nothing to do with the kind of expats or immigrants we'd like to see more of, or fewer of, in our cities. As far as sentiments go, the anti-tourist sentiment is a lot larger than the anti-expat sentiment, but even that's mostly something you'll find in a couple of the more central Barcelona neighborhoods and at 2 or 3 yearly protests. Apart from occasional exceptions, most people are not spending much time harassing foreigners on the Rambla. Anti-American sentiment in Spain. What about more specific anti-American opinions? Well, I'm glad you asked. Spain has people from a lot of different countries, all living elbow to elbow in tiny flats. Not all of the high-end immigrants are Americans. Actually, only a small number are. Madrid, for example, is becoming a sort of haven for rich Latin people who buy up million-euro flats in the nicest neighborhoods and benefit from the quicker Spanish nationality process in order to have a good plan B in case their countries go downhill. Or in some cases, Madrid is their new plan A because their country is already being wrecked by a terrible government. Looking at you, Venezuela. Outside the capital, coastal areas in Spain have been among the favorite retirement destinations for Germans and Brits since at least the 70s. I've been to places in the Canary Islands where nobody apparently speaks Spanish. So expats, whoever they are nothing new. Anyway, I'm American and a lot of the people I talk to are American. Does Spain have a general anti-American sentiment? Again, not that I've noticed. And I've been here, like I said, for over 20 years. Spain would like to welcome Mr. Marshall. There's a famous Spanish film called Bienvenido, Mr. Marshall. In it, a small town in Castilla hears a rumor that the Americans are coming to bring them some much-needed prosperity through the Marshall Plan. The movie is old, from 1953, so the setting is an impoverished post-war version of Spain that could really use a bit of the American dream. The excited villagers prepare for the Americans by dressing up in typical Andalusian outfits and setting up a flamenco show, an attempt to welcome their guests with some comfortable stereotypes. They spend all their money in the process of getting the town ready, all the while dreaming of their future prosperity. Finally, the Americans arrive in a motorcade, only to go through the town without stopping. And just like that, everyone's small-town dreams are crushed. The end. I haven't seen Bienvenido, Mr. Marshall for quite a while, but I remember it as sort of a cautionary tale disguised as a comedy. Don't expect the Americans to come save you, and don't count your chickens before they hatch. The town where it was filmed, Guadalix de la Sierra, is just to the north of Madrid, and still has a statue of the movie's fictional mayor on the balcony of the Ayuntamiento. But all this to say, Americans have been moving money in Spain for a long time. A bit of Spanish and American history. Spanish-American relations didn't start yesterday. Here's an incredibly brief summary of a few major events, in case you haven't been paying attention. Our countries went to war in 1898 in what ended up being one of the defining moments for 20th century Spain. It was probably a defining moment of 19th century Spain too, but every Civil War history talks about the disaster of 98. In American history class, I learned that the Spanish-American War was a mostly unnecessary conflict whipped up in order to sell newspapers back in New York in the heyday of the yellow press. I have yet to hear it portrayed that way in any of the Spanish histories, though. The embarrassment that Spain received at the hands of the U.S. in La Guerra de Cuba inspired a young Francisco Franco and others to later attempt to restore Spanish glory through a military coup in 1936. It's a long story, but I am reading the biography of Franco, and it talks about when he was 6 years old or something like that, the Guerra de Cuba, and how it was a formative event in Franco's childhood. Later, the U.S. stayed out of the Spanish Civil War and left Franco alone for 4 decades of fascist dictatorship, installing a few military bases, but generally letting Spain be Spain. Not everyone was thrilled, of course, that the U.S. would loudly advertise itself as defending freedom elsewhere, while allowing Franco to do his thing until his death in 1975. But that's what happened. For those several reasons, and from talking to older people, I get the impression that in the 70s and 80s, anti-American sentiment in Spain might have been more widespread than it is now. Spanish-American relations in the 21st century. Fast forward a few decades, the year 2004, incidentally the same year I arrived, was another pivotal year in Spanish-American relations. After the train bombings on March 11th of that year, the conservative government was quickly voted out of office and replaced by the socialists under José Luis Rodríguez Zapatero. Zapatero pulled Spanish troops out of Iraq. Allegedly, the Atocha terrorists were responding to Spain's involvement in the Iraq War. But the Iraq War was hugely unpopular among Spaniards even before the bombings. Personally, I was against the Iraq War too, but never had any idea that Spain was involved. Apparently, it was a plan by the Prime Minister at the time to kiss up to George W. Bush and Tony Blair, and it backfired spectacularly. Anyway, I moved to Spain as all this was happening, and I can't say that I noticed any anti-American sentiment coming out of it. If anything, it seemed like Spanish people understood that national governments do things without asking the opinions of random guys like me, and that U.S. foreign policy wasn't my fault. So while people may have had strong opinions about foreign wars, they didn't apparently translate that into any sort of animosity towards regular people from the U.S. More recently, Spanish people seemed pretty excited about Barack Obama back in 2008, and less than thrilled with Trump in 2016. But for the most part, folks are managing their affairs without much reference to U.S. party politics. Anti-Americanism in the Spanish media. So, among normal Spanish people living their daily lives, I don't think there's much of an anti-American sentiment. There is, however, a good bit of anti-Americanism in the media. The paper I follow these days, La Vanguardia, is based here in Barcelona, and it seems to have an editorial position revolving around 3 main theories. 1. Donald Trump is an idiot and a fascist. 2. American capitalism is a failure, and the empire, such as it was, is now collapsing. And 3. Around 51% of Americans are stupid, and that explains most things about U.S. politics. Now, you may or may not agree with those theories, but in any case, they're not very original. Lots of other publications in the U.S. and elsewhere seem to share approximately the same editorial line. And I guess I could write a long article about each point, but honestly, I don't care that much. I will say, however, that I used to believe the last one, that U.S. politics can be explained by the stupidity of approximately half of the population. But I don't believe it anymore. These days, I see that as a comfortable fiction peddled by elitists who don't actually have solutions. It's far easier to assume that people who disagree with you are stupid than it is to refute their arguments, because having an actual debate might expose the weakness of your position. Finally, not everything is political. Some people, Spanish and otherwise, want to make everything political all the time. If you're going to find any anti-expat or anti-American sentiment here in Spain or elsewhere in Europe, it's probably among those people. They're the people who go to protests, a small but vocal minority. And if you're the type of person who moves abroad and then tries to make everything about politics in your new country, well, you're sort of asking for it. A lot of Americans these days feel the need to tell people they've just met where they stand politically. So after 5 minutes of conversation, you already know who they voted for in the last several election cycles. It's exhausting and unnecessary. But also, if you've started a political conversation, it might go off in ways you don't like. One of the things that Americans tend to love about Spain is that people are more relaxed about politics, and we can all keep it that way by not imposing our pet issues when we come here. So here's my 2 cents. Do the Spanish hate expats? Are they tired of Americans? Maybe. They might in fact have those opinions. But as long as you're respectful and don't bring it up, they'll probably just keep their mouths shut. It's called convivencia, and it's something Spanish people value a lot. Just don't get caught putting chorizo in a paella. That's about all I've got for today. Thank you for listening. I hope you're having a great day wherever you are in the world. You can go to expatmadrid.com to read the article here. I've got a lot of links to other things because I've talked about basically every single other topic mentioned in this article elsewhere. I can't really put links inside a podcast, but on the blog, expatmadrid.com, I've got a lot of extra stuff that you can read. Here at home, my wife Morena and I occasionally have an expat versus immigrant debate of our own, because while she's the classic expat, fancy career, advanced degree, came to Spain on a highly qualified visa, she's also from a poorer country and, as her name suggests, rather dark in complexion. I, on the other hand, overstayed a tourist visa and hung out illegally for several years. With my high school education, I'm qualified for nothing, but I'm from a richer country and incapable of even minimal tanning. I am, in other words, an immigrant, or perhaps an expat. It depends on who you ask. Like I said, the whole argument is sort of dumb and doesn't really lead to anything, so I try to avoid it to the extent that I can. I have talked about the difference between expats and immigrants before. There's an episode of the podcast somewhere about it. Looks like it's episode 15, Expats and Immigrants and Geary's Oh My. So you can check that out if you would like. Episode 8 is about dating Spanish girls. That article is the most popular thing I've ever written. It's on the blog also. On the podcast is episode 8. These days I am not dating Spanish girls because I am married. However, it is a very popular topic apparently out there on the interwebs. You can check that out if you're into that sort of thing. Another episode you might like is episode 106, Is Spain Overrated? I talk about Instagram and how people develop high expectations for life abroad that might not be quite an accurate representation of reality. So all that is here on the podcast. You could also go to expatmadrid.com for much more. Over there on expatmadrid.com, of course, you have the donation page, expatmadrid.com/donate. You could donate €3. You could donate €300 if you wanted. I'm open to any amount that you feel like sending my way. It'll help me to, buy books for my research, pay my enormous Spanish tax bills that seem to arrive every 2 weeks or so, things like that. I appreciate the donations. I will give you a shout out on a future episode. Thanks a lot. Go to YouTube and put in Learn Spanish with Daniel if you are interested in learning Spanish. All of the episodes of the podcast are on there, but I also have quite a few videos for people trying to learn Spanish. Last week I did the verb ir, which is to go. So I conjugated the verb ir as well as giving a lot of examples of ir in the infinitive and in all the conjugations in the present. This week I might be a bit ambitious and give you ir in the past, because at some point we're going to have to talk about the past. Anyway, that is Learn Spanish with Daniel over on YouTube. You can subscribe there, you can like some videos. You can comment telling me what you would like to see in a future video. All of these are good options. The algorithms just want to see activity, so if you are active on there, I appreciate it. You could follow me on Instagram. I am at Daniel Welsh, just my name, Welsch. I post on there with some frequency. I don't know, not all the time, but I'm on there. You can send me a message if you would like. If you are coming to Spain, and you should, please don't worry about the anti-tourist or anti-expat sentiment. It's very limited to a small number of people who are usually pretty weird in other ways. Anyway, I have a couple of recommendations if you're coming to Spain. One is Devour Tours. Devour Tours organize food tours all over Spain. They're in several major cities. I'll just make a link and you can check out their offer. This is an affiliate link, so if you buy a tour, I will get a little bit of money. Go to expatmadrid.com/devour. Devour, synonym for eat. Devour Tours was founded by my friend Lauren way back in the day, and they're now in several countries. So just check out expatmadrid.com/devour, and you can see their various offerings. I went to one in Madrid a long time ago, and I liked it a lot. It's a great experience if you're into food and you want to see some of the places that are not the touristy places, but places where locals might go for good food. Another thing I highly recommend is biketourinspain.com. I have talked about this plenty on here. Biketourinspain.com. You can talk to Raul over there and tell him that I sent you. I've done 2 of the bike tours that Raul organizes. There is the one that I did in La Mancha, which was the route of Don Quixote. I did that about a year ago. And then last November, I did a tour of Extremadura. The route of Don Quixote was great and I enjoyed it a lot. I enjoyed the literary tie-in. The Extremadura route was literally one of the best Spain experiences I have had in 20 years. So I highly recommend that you check those out. Just go to biketourinspain.com. I've seen that on Instagram, Raul is out looking like scouting for new bike routes, so maybe he's got something new happening soon. You can find everything on biketourinspain.com or look for the episodes of the podcast dealing with these things. I think Extremadura is episode 94 if you would like to hear more about that. And Quixote, the route of Don Quixote, is episode 76. I also have videos on YouTube if you would like to see on the Learn Spanish with Daniel channel. Because I'm terrible at branding, I do all kinds of other things besides teaching Spanish on there, for example. Videos of my bike tours. So you can check those out, get an idea of what goes on. It's not hugely demanding physically. If you're in reasonable shape, you should be able to do it. So take a look, biketourinspain.com. As usual, thanks for listening. Hope you have a great day, and hasta la próxima. Bye.